Jennifer, I'll just take an extra minute, first of all, to thank the organisers for this wonderful conference, for inviting me, and for this opportunity to meet so many fascinating people. Thank you. Second of all, I realise that I'm the final speaker of today. Just you should know, towards the end of my paper, I touch on Israeli politics, so it might be worthwhile to keep awake. I grew up in Betar. I learned of Betar's role in the struggle against the British in Palestine, but I heard nothing of Betar's struggle against the Nazis in Europe. When I retired a few years ago, I decided to research this conundrum at the University of Sydney. The conventional wisdom has been the Jewish armed resistance was the domain primarily of the socialist and communist youth movements, while little is known about the role of Betar in these activities. My research is an attempt to redress this record. My research is still in its early stages. There is already quite a deal of evidence showing that Betar indeed participated in resistance to the Nazis. At the end of this presentation, I will lay before you some suggestions as to why we know so little about this resistance. Permit me to point out that I'm only midway in my research of this subject, and my attendance at this conference is less about being heard, but more about learning from you and hearing your suggestions as to possible ways in which I might continue to support my research results. Please note that in my presentation, firstly, I use the Jabotinsky movement and Betar interchangeably, and secondly, I do not wish to enter into the debate of what is resistance, which has been most thoroughly covered by many scholars, notably Yehuda Bauer, in proposing the use of the term Amidah. I am concentrating only on armed resistance. In December 1943, Emanuel Ringelblum wrote to his colleague, "Why is there no information on the ZZW in the history? They must leave an imprint, even if our eyes they are unsympathetic." 40 years later, in 1983, Israel Gutman echoed similar sentiments. Quote, "The most outstanding example is the neglect, almost to the point of total omission, of the Jewish military organization founded by the revisionists and members of Betar in the Warsaw Ghetto." And he also pointed out that we lack the kind of authoritative material that will enable us to trace the steps in its formation. With the sole exception of Chaim Lazar Litai's writing, it took a further 25 years before serious attempts were made to rectify the situation. Other scholars have brought attention to the distorted history of resistance. For instance, Tuvia Freiling, in his article "A Blatant Oversight, the Right Wing in Israeli Holocaust Historiography." Over the past 10 years, the role and significance of the Jabotinsky movement in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising has finally emerged into the open, no doubt largely due to the publicity surrounding the publication of Moshe Aaron's book, Flags Over the Warsaw Ghetto. True, Aaron's work has generated some academic criticism. However, it was the catalyst for public recognition of a group who had for the most part been excluded from the historical narrative of resistance to the Nazis. I use excluded intentionally. I do not mean omitted, as we shall see at the end of my presentation. At about the same time as Aaron's book was published, Libionka and Weinbaum published a scholarly work on the role of the two main fighting organizations in the Warsaw Ghetto. This work has been published in the Polish language and so unfortunately is not accessible to the wider public or even to the majority of scholars, myself included. Libionka and Weinbaum seem to readily discount a lot of what Chaim Lazar Litai and other members of Betar have written, while also admitting that there is meager archival material at our disposal. Chaim Lazar Litai was the only scholar who wrote extensively on the resistance of the Jabotinsky movement to the Nazis, particularly in the Vilna and Warsaw ghettos. More recently, some other scholars have taken up the baton and in one way or another tackled some of the issues surrounding Betar's involvement in the resistance. The Jabotinsky movement's association with the Polish government and the Home Army during the war had been covered in two books published last year, Timothy Snyder's Black Earth and Joshua Zimmerman's The Polish Underground and the Jews, 1939 to 1945. My curiosity has been aroused away from the well-known uprisings, and I'm focusing my attention on Betar's participation in the lesser-known towns and villages, which have not been given their rightful place in the historical narrative. In the 1930s in particular, the Jabotinsky movement was a unified body consisting of the political arm of the movement, Hatzoah, and its youth movement was Betar. Brit Chayal was the group within the movement whose members had served in the National Army, the Polish Army, Brit Yeroshin, the ultra-Orthodox branch, and Veref, the women's organization. In order to survey Betar's armed resistance to the Nazis in Eastern Europe, it was necessary initially to identify where its branches were in the period 23 to 45. One of my first points of reference was the 3 volumes of Sefer Betar book. Unfortunately, the 4th volume, dealing with the war years, was never written. In 1939, there were about 70,000 members of Betar in Poland, probably the largest youth movement in Poland, Jewish youth movement in Poland. In the other Eastern European countries, there were a further 20 to 30,000 Betarim. My sources have been Yad Vashem, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Moreshet Lochamei Getaot, and the Jabotinsky movement in Tel Aviv. In seeking as many examples of Betar's participation in resistance to the Nazis, I turned to the vast resource of the Yizkor books. Fortunately, scans of most of them are available online from the New York Public Library. I'll digress for a few minutes to briefly describe the Yizkor books, just in case any members of this audience are not familiar with them. I do this with a certain amount of trepidation, as we have amongst us here today Professor Rosemary Horowitz, who is most probably the leading authority on the genre. The Yizkor books are the result of a long-standing tradition in Judaism whereby Jews record the history and folklore of the places where they lived, as well as memorials for the Jewish communities and their members who were killed in anti-Jewish riots. Abraham Vine, one of the early researchers of the Yizkor books, found that nearly all of them discuss Jewish armed resistance. Foreshadowing the Holocaust, several Yizkor books were written in the 1920s and 1930s on 3 towns in the Ukraine, commemorating the victims of the pogroms of 1919. One in particular became a model for hundreds of Yizkor books written after the Second World War, which not only record the names of those murdered, but give a picture of the Jewish life in the town as well as its history. The number of Yizkor books is still a source of disagreement amongst scholars, but is usually regarded to be between 800 and 900. The internet site jewishgen.com has initiated a momentous effort in having the Yizkor books translated into English. However, as with any translation, this carries with its problems of accuracy and authenticity, particularly as some translators are amateurs, while others translate only parts of the text or provide only condensed summaries. The Yiddish texts are particularly vulnerable to distortions. In using the Yizkor books for research, these limitations should be considered, particularly the political orientations of the various writers, editors, and publishing groups. Permit me to say a few words about my methodological approach. The online Yizkor books were carefully screened, and about 4,000 pages referring to Betar resistance were copied and filed, arranging them by town name in alphabetical order. During this process, a table was established indicating town name, country, and geographical coordinates, and whether there were references to resistance and/or to Betar, and in what language. I found the geographic coordinates as an essential tool to identify and differentiate between towns. This information was supplemented with English translations from the Jewish Gen website and elsewhere. The resulting table has 1,408 entries. The collected texts were then perused for possible connections between Betar and resistance. Of the 1,408 towns, 48 were found to have substantial information connecting Betar and resistance. Of these, I'm now focusing on about 20 towns, 7 in Poland, 6 in Ukraine, 4 in Belarus, and 1 each in Romania, Lithuania and Moldova. To summarise some of my findings within the time limits, I will give a few examples from 2 geographical areas. Herewith is a map from the Sefer Borshov. Pardon my pronunciations, those who speak the languages. In October 1941, the resistance movement started to organise themselves. The first job was to supply themselves with ammunition. From the ghetto they went out into the night of the 6th and 7th of June 1943 and ran away to the forest. Aschendorf, the commander, and others became ill in the forest, and Shia Yeshua Zucker assumed command. On November the 17th, 1943, they attacked the Borchovo jail, released approximately 40 persons, amongst them who were 16 or 17 Jews. Consequently, they were encircled by 2,000 Germans on December the 6th, 1943. Those who had ammunition, around 16 men, stayed in the forest to fight the Germans. The unarmed men retreated deep into the forest. Those who stayed behind to fight were all killed. The November 2014 issue of the magazine of the Jabotinsky Institute, Hadashot HaMachon, carried a report and research carried out by Shlomo Abramovich, which brought to light that most of the youth in the Borchova gang were members of Betar from that town or from nearby towns. Yeshua Zucker, Mefaked of the Betar in Borshov, eventually became the commander of this group. The second town that I'm going to mention is Chodkiv, also in southwest Ukraine. When David Meir Wasserman, Mefaked Betar in Chodkiv, failed to reach Vilna, he returned to the Chodkiv ghetto and organised an underground resistance, accumulating arms and training members in their use. Apart from the Beitarim themselves, there were not many who agreed to join the Betar underground. Wasserman and some of his followers were caught up in an akция, but managed to make a small opening in the floor of the train carriage, or escaped and returned to the ghetto. Only in 1943, with the beginning of the retreat of the Germans from Russia, were there opportunities for real actions against the Germans. Members of the Betar underground escaped from the ghetto and went to the forest south of Chodkiv, where they conducted guerrilla warfare against the retreating Germans. Wasserman and many of his followers were killed in exchange of fire with a group of Volksdeutsch from Posen. And 2 towns in Belarus, Jerashin. Much has been written about the exploits of the partisan leader, Dr. Yehezkel Atlas, who was active in the Lipchanka forest of western Belarus. What is less well known is that many of the fighting force came from the ranks of Betar in Jerashin and Slonim. Some of them are mentioned in Sefer Jerashin. The head of Betar in Slonim, Shlomo Shlovatsky, was amongst them, as was Shlomo's brother Avigdor and his 2 sisters Sima and Sipora. They all perished in the forest. Eliyahu Lipsovich, born in Jerashin, a member of Betar there, and he was also a soldier in the Polish army. Eliyahu commanded the 2nd platoon of Dr. Atlas's division, and when Dr. Atlas was fatally wounded in battle, he handed the leadership of the division to Eliyahu. Other partisans who were members of Betar are also mentioned by name in the Yizkor book. And Lachva, the first to revolt, Rishon LaMered, 3 months before the establishment of the Lachva ghetto, April the 4th, 1942, Jewish youth organised underground groups, with the first group of 5 youths coming together under the leadership of Isaac Rokshin, the head of Betar. Soon 5 more groups of 5 formed, bringing the total number of underground members to 30. While efforts to secure firearms was largely unsuccessful, members did manage to acquire axes, knives and iron bars. Some firearms and grenades which had been purchased were hidden in a nearby village. There was close cooperation between the Jewish Council and the youth movement, including the Jewish Council offering money to purchase arms. The liquidation of the ghetto, Lachva ghetto, began on September the 2nd, 1942. Although Rokshin wanted to break out of the ghetto the night before, Dov Lopatin, head of the Judenrat, asked him for time so that he could learn more about the Germans' intentions. Consequently, Lopatin refused to cooperate with the Germans, choosing instead to initiate the uprising that Rokshin had demanded. The Lachva Jewish Council made a conscious decision to forgo the illusion of salvation and to share the fate of the Jewish population. Members of the underground attacked German soldiers using axes, stones and cleavers. Roschen killed a Gestapo officer with an axe and jumped into the river but was shot. Lopatin managed to flee to the forest. The Jews had some hand grenades which they used against the Germans. Chaim Chefetz was able to get a gun off a dead gendarme and return fire on the Germans. The resistance managed to kill 6 German and 8 Belarusian policemen and injured some others. Approximately 1,000 Jews broke out of the ghetto, but hundreds were killed by German machine gun fire, and only 600 managed to reach the Pripyat River. The Yizkor books names quite a few of the members of Betar in Lachva, some of whom participated in the revolt. Finally, there remains the key question: why this information has not come to light earlier, and why Betar has been ignored in much of the earlier literature on resistance to the Nazis. The absence of Betar from the early historiography of resistance might be explained by the fact that so few of its members survived, and thus the chronicle of events were, perhaps, even unaware of Betar's role in resistance, or possibly they carried their animosity even to the extent of excluding Betar from their memoir. The early years of the State of Israel experienced a left-wing monopoly of most resources, none less than the heroic resistance motive to paint a picture of the few against the many in the national struggle for survival. Was there an orchestrated effort on behalf of Mapai in the first 30 years of the state to paint a picture of the heroic left wing in its struggle against the Nazis to the exclusion of the followers of Jabotinsky? Tom Segev wrote, quote, "The labor movement in Israel adopted and embraced the symbolism of ghetto uprisings, but in so doing ignored the role of their political opponents, Cherut Betar, in the resistance to the Nazis." Within the ranks of Cherut, the political heirs of Jabotinsky, there was a factional struggle based on Jabotinsky's ideal of legionism and Menachem Begin's view of resistance to the British. The latter won out, and so within the Jabotinsky movement, the symbolism of resistance to the Nazis became secondary to the symbolism of resistance to the British. Last September 2015, there was a small article in Miskar, a survivors magazine, referring to the passing of Zota Hartmann-Rottenberg, the last of the Atzi fighters, which indicates that she blamed the movement's leadership for not having brought greater attention to those who fought in Europe. In 2007, Ronnie Stauber commented, quote, "During the 1950s, the activities of Betar members in the ghettos and forests did not become one of Cherut's symbols because they were in no way related to the struggle in Eretz Yisrael." Chaim Lazar Litai made many attempts to persuade the Jabotinsky movement's leaders to allocate resources for research into Betar's participation in armed resistance to the Nazis. They listened to him, but nothing was done, even when Begin was at the height of his powers, 1977-1983. Thank you.